everyone. My name is Markus Anderljung. My job is as head of policy for an organization called the Center for the Governance of AI. I'm going to talk to you at you for sort of 30 to 40 minutes or something like this about this, and then hopefully you guys will have some really great or some really sort of naive questions that produce sort of good conversation, etc. And then we can learn stuff together. Cool. So to start out, here's a sort of super simple, sort of naive argument in favor of caring about AI regulation. If we look at other sort of highly impactful technologies, we look at electricity, we look at aviation, the internet, or whatever, these technologies are somewhat heavily regulated. And these regulations reduce the chance of accidents and misuse in those kinds of technologies. The sort of development and use of these technologies is partly governed by sort of complex and stress-tested, what people sometimes call sort of regulatory regimes. And these are sort of rules that are often set and enforced by government and sort of various agencies. Non-compliance with these rules is often sanctioned or punished to sort of enforce compliance. And I guess my take is similar to this. We should expect that as AI systems become sort of more advanced, they become more integrated into our society, they become more impactful, we should expect regulation, at least to some extent, to play a significant role in determining sort of the use and impact of AI on society. I will in this talk, I will try to sort of cover a decent amount of ground. So sometimes I'll be pretty quick. Sometimes I may say things that don't really make sense to you. If that's the case, make a note of it, ask me afterwards, or have a question in the Q&A. I will during this little talk, I'll try to sort of defend or to sort of talk about 3 different statements. The first one is that there is a bunch of AI regulation stuff happening. There's a bunch of AI regulation processes already underway. These processes, or sort of AI regulation that might come out of this kind of stuff, or AI regulation that sort of folks like the people in this room might sort of help push in favor of, could end up helping sort of us as a society govern future, more advanced AI systems. And there are sort of concrete ways in which we can contribute to how AI is sort of regulated, both in the US but also abroad, to sort of help make sure that we sort of reach the goal of sort of number 2 here. So starting out with sort of what's currently going on, the sort of most, maybe the stuff that has sort of had the most attention put to it is sort of all of the regulatory efforts regarding AI in the EU. Some of the sort of most well-known important things to sort of keep in mind are there's the Digital Services Act and something called the Digital Markets Act that sort of primarily is focused on sort of big tech companies, big platform companies, and sort of adjusting sort of the kinds of information that they need to share with their users, for example, and also to some extent sort of how their recommender system might work. Another sort of thing that's sort of maybe more famous and sort of more getting a lot more attention is something called the AI Act, which was proposed in sort of spring of last year. And in this act, it'll probably be sort of passed sometime over the next year. That one does, the most sort of important things to know is it does 3 things. Firstly, it sort of bans certain kinds of AI uses. So for example, AI systems that sort of does social credit scoring, whatever that might be, such uses will be prohibited. They will sort of require certain AI systems to sort of it to be disclosed to their user or sort of the subject of the AI system that they are being subject to an AI system. So for example, it sort of has rules about how if I see some sort of deepfake content online, for example, there should be a little tag that sort of says that is deepfake content. So the last thing that it does, and maybe most importantly, it sort of has this list of things or sort of uses of AI that are sort of termed high risk. These are often uses of AI that might cause sort of acute risks or acute harms to specific individuals. And those systems, they might be things like AI systems used in sort of hiring, for example. And for those systems, there's a bunch of requirements imposed on the system to sort of hopefully minimize their harms. Other jurisdictions, they have like a slightly different approach. So oftentimes, people will call this EU approach something like a sort of horizontal approach, where you sort of regulate AI no matter sort of in the same way, no matter sort of where in the economy it is being used. A lot of other countries or jurisdictions, they sort of claim that they're doing something more that looks like a sort of sectoral approach. So you sort of focus on giving responsibility to sort of existing regulators out there and help them sort of figure out how to deal with AI. In the US, there's sort of historically, or sort of the past couple of years, most sort of AI policy efforts, to my mind, has looked like sort of industrial policy. So this is work trying to sort of help or bolster the sort of US AI industry. But I think that is to some extent changing. Firstly, that's changing on the state level, where there's been, over the past couple of years, there's been a bunch of different sort of AI regulatory efforts on things like the use of deepfakes or on the use of facial recognition systems, for example. There's also, I think, we should expect there to be a bit more activity on the federal level. Recently we saw the White House Office for Science and Technology Policy release something called the White House sort of Bill of Rights for AI. I don't know if they will turn it into anything in reality, but at the very least, sort of it suggests that there is sort of more desire to think about sort of ways in which sort of AI systems might sort of harm folks and what can be done to sort of reduce those kinds of harms. Lastly, we have a decent amount of activity on sort of AI regulation in China, which I think to some extent is sort of at the forefront of AI regulation. In general, this is sort of regulation that aims to sort of reduce what sort of the CCP or sort of the Chinese Communist Party might consider sort of threats to social stability. And so, for example, recommender systems are sort of reasonably heavily regulated in sort of recent regulation that's been coming out in China. And there's also sort of the most comprehensive sort of governance regime of deepfakes, etc., or sort of AI-generated content is currently in sort of proposal stage, I believe. That animation didn't really work out. So, one reaction that you might have to this talk, or to what I just said, is like, oh, but come on. The US is never going to do anything that looks like regulating AI technologies. The US federal government is very slow at regulating these kinds of things, and it would take a whole bunch of time to sort of produce anything that would sort of have teeth or sort of have any significant impact. I think that's a fair reaction, but some sort of counterpoints to that. One is that sort of, first of all, there's already a whole bunch of regulation that already exists in the economy that will apply to AI systems as they're sort of deployed in various places. I think there's also a whole bunch of sort of specific paths that might end up being important. One path is, look at this. So one path is sort of, we might just directly end up with sort of federal regulation in the US. For the reasons I previously stated, maybe that's a bit like not super plausible, or sort of might be something that you're slightly skeptical of. One path that I think seems pretty plausible is via sort of state level regulation leading to sort of federal regulation. So this is a sort of a thing that you often see. So states end up regulating something in a bunch of different ways, and then that over time puts pressure on the federal government to do the same, because sort of incoherence in regulatory regimes across the US is going to sort of cause a bunch of frictions in the economy, and then you want to solve those over time. Another thing that seems likely is this sort of path from sort of you set industry norms and best practices. Those best practices are often sort of formalized into standards over time by bodies such as NIST or the ICO, and then these standards are then sort of after a while sort of put into regulation over time. A last sort of other important sort of route to my mind is this route. So this is via sort of other jurisdictions such as the EU. They put in place a bunch of AI regulation. And then there might be a bunch of ways in which those regulations end up impacting what sort of US companies do, and that in turn sort of makes the chance of sort of federal regulation in the US more likely. I wrote a report with a colleague, Charles Sigmund, about this with regards to the EU on what you might call sort of the Brussels effect for AI. That I would recommend you have a look if you think that claim seems interesting or maybe false or something like this. So, secondly, it seems plausible to me that sort of AI regulation could help us sort of govern future more advanced AI systems. There are a few reasons for this, or sort of here are some sort of ways to think about whether that would be the case. There's sort of some claims that sort of, if true, would sort of bolster the case for that statement. One is sort of pretty obvious. I guess if there aren't any specific risks from AI, we shouldn't expect this to be particularly important. Another one is if these risks end up not being addressed by market forces. There's a bunch of different risks that technologies might pose in the world that sort of will be internalized by the company because their customers care about that risk or don't want to be sort of exposed to that kind of risk. I think it seems very likely to be the case that with a lot of AI systems, a lot of things will look like externalities, and so they won't be handled by market forces. Another claim that sort of bolsters the case in favor of AI regulation is that sort of if you think that sort of self-regulation won't be enough. I think this seems reasonably plausible, at least in worlds where you should expect this technology to diffuse a lot, where there's a bunch of different actors who are sort of developing this technology and sort of putting it onto the market. In that case, there will be sort of a bunch of competition, and that competition will often sort of determine what actors do. They'll have less space to engage in self-governance than they would be otherwise if they had sort of a less competitive market. And then sort of the case in favor of sort of regulation here is that regulation has this very nice feature where the government can actually force companies to do stuff. They can tell them that you need to meet these requirements, and if you don't, we're going to sanction you somehow. that's a pretty neat feature if you want to govern a technology. Lastly, you have to believe that sort of regulation can sort of effectively reduce risk. I'll say some things about this later. Hopefully you're convinced by this, or at least enough, but we can talk about it more. And then sort of lastly, it has to be the case that sort of geopolitical competition doesn't end up being a sort of binding constraint. And so you might think that sort of domestic regulation of AI technologies isn't going to matter very much because countries will be in sort of competition with other states, and so therefore they will sort of feel like they cannot regulate their sort of domestic AI market because that will sort of put them at a disadvantage compared to other countries. I think that seems like a really, really important dynamic. We might think that maybe that matters. That's sort of a bit less of an important dynamic recently, if it's the case that sort of the recent chip export controls that have been put in place by the US government, if those end up being affected, then maybe this sort of binding constraint will be a lot less binding than it would have been otherwise. So, okay, what would sort of useful AI regulation look like? One question that you might ask is sort of what do you want your sort of regulatory ecosystem to look like? So this is sort of the sort of whole set of actors who sort of manage the sort of AI regulation that exists in the economy. If you think of sort of AI as a general purpose technology or something of that kind, sort of a technology that will sort of be used very widely across the entire economy in ways that we cannot currently sort of imagine or we can't sort of currently predict. If that's the case, it ends up being a thing that's quite difficult to govern or difficult to regulate. And that suggests to me that one sort of useful way of thinking about what we want to do here is we want to build an ecosystem of a bunch of regulators, of government, of sort of civil society organizations or the like that can help us sort of make sure that we do this loop as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So what does this loop look like? It sort of roughly looks like you try to have sort of enough expertise, etc., to be able to monitor how AI is affecting the economy, how it's affecting people in your jurisdiction. If you find sort of flaws in your current regime, then you end up sort of trying to design potential solutions to those kinds of things. You implement those solutions, and once you've done that, you sort of go back around the loop again. And so I think one way to view what we're doing when we're thinking about sort of putting in place effective AI regulation is creating an ecosystem that can sort of handle this loop well. Another thing that you might ask is sort of what does actual regulation itself look like? There's a bunch of different things that you could talk about there. A whole bunch of features that you might sort of focus on. I'll try to focus on two of them. One is sort of the extent to which is about sort of choosing the right point of intervention to sort of regulate the use of AI. One way to sort of split that up is to think about one thing that you can do is that you can sort of try to restrict capabilities, you can restrict sort of access to either AI technologies or to sort of the resources needed to build AI technologies. And so you can do things like ban the development or deployment of certain kinds of systems. Another thing you can do is you can try to limit access to sort of certain inputs to AI development to certain actors. Another thing you can do is you can sort of, once sort of AI systems have been trained, a thing that you can do is you can sort of look at how the deployment decision happens, and you can do things like require a whole bunch of sort of things in the sort of training process. You can sort of put in place a whole bunch of tests and evaluations that need to be done on the systems before they're deployed into the economy. And another thing that you can do is you can sort of enforce a bunch of external scrutiny of the model before it sort of sees the light of day or sort of starts engaging with the wider world in a bunch of ways. Another thing you can do is you can sort of have interventions at the layer sort of after deployment. And so you can do things like restrict what users are allowed to access the particular system, or you can try to access sort of what they can do with that system. And so you can do things like set up sort of know your customer systems for sort of the deployment when you deploy these systems, and sort of you have a list of sort of the kinds of actors that might not be allowed to access certain kinds of systems. There's a bunch of other things that you might want to do that I've listed there. Another thing that you might want to do is you might sort of solve certain kinds of governance problems. I think can be solved by giving sort of users more choice over the kinds of AI systems that they engage with, or sort of the kinds of values that the AI system uses when it sort of provides you a certain service. Another thing you can do is you can try to limit actuators. So you can make it the case that sort of AI systems are only allowed to sort of access certain kinds of actuators, certain kinds of ways of engaging with the world or having sort of real world effects. And you can sort of make that sort of conditional on meeting certain requirements about sort of the system being sufficiently aligned or whatever it might be. to give that a little bit more flavor, if we think about sort of different kinds of problems or different kinds of worries that you might have in mind, it seems plausible to me that sort of that will have you choose a different sort of cluster of interventions. And so you might see sort of this sort of list here as a bit of a smorgasbord from which you can choose a bunch of stuff depending on sort of the specific worry that you want to deal with. And so, for example, if you're worried about current AI systems, it seems plausible to me that a lot of the interventions that you need to focus on are sort of before and after deployment. So you might want to do things like have a bunch of features that you want these systems to have. You list out those features. You require folks to ensure that your system has those kinds of features, and then you enforce that in various kinds of ways. Other harms you can sort of deal with via these kinds of things. And so, for example, with sort of critical decision-making systems, you could try to enforce sort of make sure that those cause less harm by sort of introducing contestability, for example. So if a decision is made and I think it seems wrong for certain kinds of reasons, I can sort of contest it to a human or something like this. If you're worried about sort of misuse of sort of systems that sort of are useful in some kind of way, or they sort of do what their user intends, but the user intends something bad, here's some other things that you might want to do. In that kind of way, in that kind of world, you could sort of choose to try to make sure that certain kinds of systems are sort of not developed, or at least they are developed by a smaller number of actors. Another thing you could do is you could sort of, once those systems are developed, you could sort of limit how those systems can be used. And so if you have systems that, for example, could be used to develop novel pathogens or whatever it might be, in that kind of world, you might want to sort of give very wide access to the technologies, sort of all the nice things you could do without that kind of technology, but you might want to have ways to ensure that sort of creating having sort of being able to create the sort of novel pathogen bit might sort of be less widely available. Another thing that you could imagine is sort of thinking about sort of if you're worried about the problem of potentially future more capable AI systems being very, very difficult to align to human values or to the users' sort of intentions. What you might do then to sort of give you a bit more flavor of sort of what we can do with AI regulation. One way to sort of put the problem here is that one thing that we might want to do is we might want to sort of regulate training runs of concern. And so to do that, here's sort of a rough sketch of what that regulatory regime might look like. So firstly, we might want to sort of identify what might be training runs of concern. You could do that by sort of maybe you set a threshold of the amount of compute that the system would be using. Maybe you could have that sort of threshold change over time. So you could say that sort of that threshold is some x greater than the sort of largest existing system that has been sort of considered safe or hasn't caused a bunch of harm or something like this. You could also look at the sort of underlying algorithm, the sort of data set that's being used, or maybe look at sort of the actuators that the AI system will have access to. Next, you might want to impose a whole bunch of requirements on the development of such models or of such systems. That could include a whole bunch of different things. I guess one sort of set of requirements that seem the most plausible to me to be very, very helpful are things that look like mandating a whole bunch of sort of independent external red teaming of these systems. And so maybe in the ideal scenario, what it looks like is you have sort of certain things that look like if you manage to get your system to do X in that world, then it's no bueno to sort of put this system out to the world. And then you have a whole bunch of sort of external folks come in and they get to sort of look at whether your system exhibits that behavior or not. And if yes, don't deploy. And then on top of that, you need to sort of put in place a whole bunch of systems that are required to sort of enforce and monitor that regime, maybe update it over time, and sort of make sure that sort of the relevant developers are actually sort of complying with these requirements. So that sort of gives you some sense of the kind of regulatory system that we might want to sort of try to build in the future. Another thing that ends up being very important, this is sort of the second feature that I was interested in sort of pointing out, that ends up being very, very important when you're designing a regulatory regime, is just to make sure that it doesn't cause regulatory flight. And so it's the case that a lot of regulatory regime, or at least some kinds of regulation, sort of incentivizes companies or various actors to just move their activity elsewhere. If that happens as a result of AI regulation, that seems really, really bad, because that ends up sort of producing some kind of regulatory race to the bottom, where if I'm a country and I have sort of higher regulatory standards than other places, I'm going to be put at a disadvantage, and so that's going to sort of push all of these jurisdictions to sort of have less regulation. That would be worrying. I do think that there are a bunch of ways in which you might sort of design AI regulation that would have that effect, but I do think there's a bunch of things that you could do to sort of have the opposite effect. And so, for example, see my earlier statement about sort of the chance that the EU and their sort of AI regulatory regime might end up having effects across sort of other economies outside of the EU. The sort of rough way in which this happens is that if you mandate, for example, that sort of AI systems that are used, say in the EU or maybe say in the US, meet certain features, and it's really, really expensive to sort of put in place those features, and it's really, really expensive to sort of have two different systems, one for the US market, for example, and one for markets outside of the US. In that world, companies will often be incentivized to just develop one system that is compliant with sort of the sort of higher regulatory burdens, and then they will just deploy that globally. If that's the case, we might have the opposite of regulatory flight. We might see regulatory diffusion. So now let's move on to sort of some sort of concrete ways in which I think that sort of you guys in this room or other folks can sort of try to push current regulation in useful directions. And that sort of, in doing so, hopefully we can sort of help build sort of regulatory regimes that ends up being helpful for doing too. So I guess up top, it seems plausible to me that, or sort of justifying why this sort of number 3 here makes sense, is that it seems to me that it's likely that there's going to be at least some kinds of sort of path dependency in regulation. And so if we, in other words, sort of if we engage now in sort of improving AI regulation in various ways, that will sort of hopefully make it the case that future AI regulation is sort of more effective. This is for a few reasons. One thing that you might point to is that sort of it might help sort of establish issue frames and sort of precedent that might be useful in the future. And so, for example, if you have certain ways of describing AI risk in current regulation, that will be pulled on in future bits of regulation that might be passed, and it might sort of affect how policymakers, for example, thinks about the risks from AI. Another thing that you might do is that sort of you might affect sort of standards, and standards oftentimes are quite sticky, and they remain for a long time. And so if you can sort of affect those in useful directions and sort of make those future-proof or sort of more able to deal with future, more capable AI systems, that seems like that sort of also has some kind of path dependency. Another way in which you might see this path dependency is sort of in putting in place AI regulation, you might sort of just affect the sort of market, and maybe in some ways you can sort of affect the AI technology that gets developed. In some way, sort of, if you regulate to make it the case that sort of AI systems need to be more interpretable than they used to be, or than they would be otherwise, then you're in some sense sort of forcing the market economy to subsidize research into interpretability. And so that's another way in which this might be pretty helpful. So now I'll just go through a sort of a list of specific, this is maybe the sort of some hypotheses bit of the talk, or at least the sort of most some hypotheses bit of the talk, where I'll go through some sort of claims of mine of ways in which we can sort of adjust or shift or change current sort of AI regulatory efforts for the better, or in directions that to me seem like that will be helpful in dealing with future more advanced AI systems. One claim is that it seems plausible to me that sort of a wholly sectoral approach, i.e. that looks like a regulatory approach where sort of governments say something like, oh, we have a bunch of regulatory bodies out there that deal with various things. We have the FDA, etc., and we just let them get on with their jobs. They just have to figure out how to deal with AI in their specific domain. My claim is that that doesn't seem sufficient, and that might sort of cause problems in the future. One way to sort of put this point is that if it's the case that AI systems, or sort of individual AI systems, will be sort of used in a bunch of different domains in the economy, then it might be particularly important to have some sort of coherence in the kinds of requirements that are put on AI systems or deployers of AI systems. And that might be important both to sort of reduce risk, and it might also be important and this is sort of things that maybe sort of policymakers might be more interested in, it might also be useful in supporting industry. Because if you sort of have your requirements be somewhat coherent across the economy, that will reduce your sort of regulatory burdens that you're imposing on companies. Another thing that seems plausible to me is that sort of something like foundation models or base models will end up needing to be a regulatory target. By regulatory target, I mean that they will be sort of something upon which requirements are imposed by government or by regulators. Here are some examples of various foundation models. I guess you probably know what foundation models are. They're basically models that sort of end up being used in a whole bunch of different applications. Usually they have some kind of quite general sort of capability that you can sort of adapt and use for a whole bunch of different things. And what are some reasons that sort of it makes sense today to sort of think about regulating foundation models in particular? One reason is that they end up being sort of a single point of failure in the economy. So you have one system, that system is used in a whole bunch of different applications. That means that sort of flaws that you might have in this system might sort of peter out, or it might sort of affect all of these different systems, and that suggests that there might be some kind of single point of failure thing here. There might be some kind of externalities that are imposed by that system not working working appropriately. So imagine that you sort of have that system, and that system has sort of some cybersecurity failure or something like this. That means that it's sort of all of these different applications that were using the system didn't work. It seems implausible that the economy will make it the case that that company is internalizing all of that cost that it might be imposing on all of its customers. Another reason that you might need to sort of regulate foundation models is that it might be needed to govern misuse of these technologies. And so it might be the case that these foundation models just makes it a lot easier for many individuals to, or sort of individual actors or maybe non-state actors and that kind of thing, to sort of cause harm in various ways. Because, for example, it might become much cheaper to produce a whole bunch of text that looks somewhat coherent at the very least, or to produce sort of images that might be used for sort of political disinformation or whatever it might be. If that's the case, the producer of the foundation model might be a particularly useful sort of intervention point to sort of avoid that misuse. And so we might put in requirements on them to do things like use restrictions. So we might sort of push them in favor of sort of having folks access their model via API, for example, and they have a bunch of filters of sort of certain things that you can't do, and maybe they have logs of what people did with their system, and then law enforcement can sort of maybe request those logs to see whether it looks like a particular sort of harm was produced by a particular user of that model, for example. Another thing that you might want to put in place is just user restrictions, and so just sort of basic sort of know your customer type stuff to make sure that maybe non-state actors don't have access to the model. Another thing that seems very plausible to me is that I want regulators to sort of realize that different tasks or different things that people will be doing with AI systems are likely to require different kinds of requirements. So this is sort of answering the question of sort of along which dimensions does it make sense to have sort of coherence across the economy in how AI systems are regulated. And a claim that seems kind of plausible to me is that sort of the type of task that the AI system does is a particularly useful dimension here. And so you might want to have particular regulation or particular requirements that are similar for recommender systems across the economy, no matter sort of which bit of it it's being used for. Another sort of norm or thing that I think we can start pushing for today is something like compute indexed regulation. And so the claim here would be something like, we want regulatory burdens to be roughly proportional to the risks or sort of externalities that this sort of particular thing that is being regulated sort of imposes on the rest of society. One useful proxy of that, or sort of the potential risk or externalities imposed, increasingly will probably be sort of the amount of compute used to train the system, because the amount of compute used to train the system will sort of be a reasonable proxy, or at least a decent proxy compared to a lot of other things, of the amount of sort of capabilities that the system will have. The amount of capabilities the system will have impacts on sort of what the system can be misused for, what people, and sort of the potential harm that it might be able to cause. Also, probably the amount of sort of beneficial uses the model can be put to. That then suggests that sort of the actor who has sort of control over this sort of more capable model probably has more responsibility to sort of make sure that it's sort of benefiting society in various ways. I think there are some things we can do today to sort of start pushing in this general direction. One example of this is in terms of science funding. So when government make decisions about sort of who to give lots and lots of money to, and maybe increasingly also about who or what researchers to give lots and lots of compute to have them train AI models, it seems very plausible to me that government should impose bigger sort of responsible AI requirements if they are being given more compute. Another thing that you can do is you can focus specifically on the requirements. So one very simple model of like what AI regulation will often look like is that you will sort of point out a specific regulatory target, some specific thing in the economy, usually an AI system or sort of a deployment of an AI system. You'll impose requirements on that thing, and then you'll sort of try to enforce those requirements. One thing that one can do is one can focus on what those requirements are and try to change those into, or sort of adjust those to be more future-proof in various ways. One thing in particular that I'm excited about there is the pretty commonsensical thing of trying to make it the case that concepts in the vicinity of alignment are on those lists. Currently, I don't think that that's actually the case, and I think that's kind of bad, and something that people should try to do something about. some sort of angles that one would have to sort of try to do that. One is to start talking about sort of AI loyalty, or sort of talk about there being situations where sort of the developer of the system, or sort of the deployer of the system, has certain duties to the user of that system, and that sort of the system should be trained to sort of act in the interest of their user instead of their developer. Something like that seems like a plausible thing to push for in certain domains. One example of where one could do that would be, for example, with regards to search, for example, or maybe with regards to recommender systems. If one does that, that seems like a reasonably good thing to me to sort of start getting the ball rolling and sort of insert concepts that are sort of similar to alignment into these kinds of processes. Another sort of thing that it seems plausible to me that one should put in here is sort of when one talks, for example, when one talks of sort of risk management of AI systems, it seems plausible to me that one should sort of highlight that there might be problems of sort of goal misgeneralization or sort of specification failures, where you might sort of have a certain goal, you train your system to do a specific thing, but then it turns out, oh, I'm using it in a different context from the training environment, and then it turned out that sort of it wasn't quite capturing the goal I thought it was capturing. Having that in these kinds of requirements, or sort of these lists of sort of things that sort of the developer should ensure that the system doesn't sort of have flaws that the system doesn't fall prey to, that seems like a useful thing to do. Another thing that you could do is sort of push in favor of either just making sure that AI systems have higher interpretability, like having that as a requirement itself. Another thing that you could do is you could push in favor of sort of ways of interpreting requirements that require higher interpretability. So one thing that seems kind of plausible to me here is that when people are worried about sort of AI systems sort of being biased or discriminating against certain populations, the sort of way this is often operationalized is in terms of objective outcomes. And so it's things like sort of the proportion of different groups that actually get the sort of the goodies that this AI system is sort of distributing. My guess is that quite often that's not all that people care about. My guess is that quite often the main thing that maybe people care about is the extent to which decisions are made on unreasonable grounds, such as sort of the gender or the ethnicity, for example, of the person. If one could sort of push for that interpretation of what it means for a model to be fair, then it seems plausible to me that that might both sort of increase the sort of fairness of these models and also increase their sort of interpretability. And that also seems useful for sort of future, more capable systems, so in sort of being able to govern those. It also seems plausible to me that there's a bunch of stuff that we could do to sort of improve developer and sort of deployer governance in all of these requirements. So changing the sort of specific risk management processes that are often required. Here's sort of a list of things that you can sort of engage with to sort of help with these sort of goals that I talked about. And yeah, I'll just leave that up for you. And I will give you all some time to give some questions and see if you can talk about some useful things.
I have a question. So there's this question of like, okay, if you're some AI alignment, like really worried about X risk type, what should you do to influence like AI regulation to get what you want? But probably like there are lots of other groups thinking this, right? So for instance, Google probably thinks, how should I influence AI regulation to get what Google wants? So like if I'm imagining this variety of stakeholders with like kind of regulatory heft, what should I think of the likely equilibrium to be?
I'm not really sure. I think you should expect, like, I guess my priors would be that, like, in countries like the US, you should expect the sort of the things that look like they are in the interest of business to sort of have a decent amount of heft behind it and seem likely to sort of be pushed in favor of. If you are particularly interested in sort of alignment type things, I think there are like a bunch of cases in which those interests might overlap. And so I think that seems like useful to keep in mind. In general, I think that like the sort of if you're a big tech company, then quite often it might be the case that regulation is good for you. So for example, it seems plausible to me that GDPR, for example, which imposed a really large amounts of regulatory burdens, was probably quite useful for at least for companies like Microsoft, because part of their sort of sales pitch is we are big and we are really sensible and really responsible and we're really, really good at dealing with very complex regulation, whereas sort of smaller companies might not be able to sort of have that kind of regulation. So I do think that there's a bunch of ways in which there might be useful overlaps between those groups. I don't have a super good sense of like the extent to which like worries about risks from AI, like how much they will inform sort of the final output of regulation. In the EU, it seems very plausible to me, or it seems to me that like a lot of the impetus there comes from worries about sort of AI systems today causing a bunch of harm, maybe in particular from worries that you might sort of find in the AI ethics community. I think there's probably also a lot of really useful overlap with folks who care about AI alignment. And then in the US, I guess I'm expecting there to be, over time, as like AI systems become more misused, it seems pretty plausible to me that over the next couple of years, there's going to be some pretty like, there's going to be more and more worry about like AI misuse in the economy, and that seems very likely to me to lead to, at the very least, on like state level, a decent amount of sort of regulatory effort. And I think like there's a lot of overlap there in terms of like how to deal with misuse with wanting to deal with sort of misalignment of systems as well. And yeah, that's a thing that I'm currently thinking a lot about, and currently trying to do research on where that overlap might be, and what we could do to sort of help deal with misuse in a way that like deals with element issues as well. Does that kind of get at what you were getting at?
Kind of.
Cool.
Thank you. It was a super important talk. Something that you mentioned was that foundation models should become a regulatory target. I guess what I'm worried about is that given that the current EU AI doesn't really touch upon regulation for those models, I'm afraid that the whole topic of AI regulation won't be revisited for the next, let's say, 5 years on an EU level. And I feel like there's a stark discrepancy between the speed of regulation and like the speed of like basically advancements in the field.
Yep.
Do you feel like a top-down approach from the government side is the way, like from the political side, is something that we should push for, or does it make more sense to actually work with the companies, try to go the route that you mentioned via developers, deployers, and try basically this like best practice approach bottom-up regulation?
Yeah, so firstly one of the currently most hot topic issues in talk about the AI Act is whether something that sort of the Europeans or sort of folks that are involved in this discussion calls general purpose AI systems, whether they should be a regulatory target. Probably what that will look like in practice is certain kinds of systems that are termed general purpose AI systems, which kind of is similar to what people are pointing to when they say foundation models. It's still a bit unclear what they actually are pointing to. Will have they'll have a bunch of requirements imposed upon them, and so the general thought here is something like you have someone who produces a foundation model, someone takes that model and sort of puts it to a specific use, and then sort of European policymakers are worried about how if you impose all of the sort of AI Act requirements on this guy, the sort of deployer of the system, then they think that this might be unfair, or it might be causing a bunch of problems, because maybe it's the case that sort of the foundation model over here is behind an API or something like this, and so the deployer might have a lot of difficulties in sort of ensuring compliance. Also, if you're the EU, you might also be interested in, if you can, sort of impose requirements on big tech companies, oftentimes sort of headquartered in the US, rather than sort of EU-based companies. You might be excited about that as well. And so that's a big issue. I haven't followed the debates there. Basically, what's happened is the EU Council, which is one of 3 bodies that is sort of the main big deals in sort of EU policymaking. In their recent proposal, or sort of their recent proposal of sort of amendments to the EU AI Act, they would have regulation of general purpose AI systems or foundation models. And it seems reasonably plausible to me that the EU Parliament will come to the same conclusion, but I don't really know. If I were to like put out a number now of like likelihood of sort of general purpose AI systems being a regulatory target in the AI Act, I don't know, maybe it would be like around 50% or something. And it seems plausible. Yeah, I'm in favor, I think, of making sure that that's the case this go around. Partly for the reasons that you point out of like, oh, once you've put in place a regulatory regime, it tends to be kind of sticky and it's kind of difficult to change. And policymakers are like, yeah, they're exhausted by a multi-year process. It takes a lot of effort. and so then I guess the question is, like in other domains, to what extent should you sort of take this more sort of incremental approach? I think in the US that seems like a reasonable approach to take. It also seems plausible to me that sort of like frontier development of sort of very big models that are maybe done more for research purposes or something like this, that they will at some point they should be regulated in some way, and it seems to me that the way to start moving there is via this more incrementalist approach, where maybe that looks like you you take frontier developers and you try to put them in a room and you try to say, hey, could you develop a code of conduct for how one should act as a frontier developer, for example. And then you can start building on that over time. Partly because that seems like a case where, if you were to just like have legislatures just come up with something today, it would probably not be very good, or like the requirements would be quite off or something. And so then putting more effort into like getting it right seems good.
Yeah, hello. So to follow up on that, who do you think should have the legal burden of general purpose AI systems or foundation models? Should that, in one aspect, should that rely on the developers or the companies that deploy these systems in usually narrower scopes? And how do things like auditing, markets, and insurance play into this ecosystem as well?
Yeah, I think it's a really tricky question. It seems to me that you want. So if you are a policymaker and you're thinking about whether to regulate foundation models, there's a few different reasons that you might want to do that. I pointed out a few of them. So one is this thing of like you want to ensure that the downstream developer can actually be compliant. That argument I think is like maybe it's not super strong because I think that like if you are a downstream developer and you struggle to be compliant if you use a certain foundation model, then that will just mean that foundation model won't be very competitive on the market, and so there will be like pressures to sort of have various contractual arrangements, for example, that makes it the case that the downstream actor can actually ensure compliance. Though there might be some usefulness in sort of having some kind of government intervention to make sure that process happens in some kind of standardized way, and that will sort of reduce reduce a bunch of frictions or whatever. That seems reasonably plausible to me. One that you can't solve via that kind of these sort of market mechanisms would be sort of how these costs are distributed across the supply chain. And so I think that seems like that might be an important thing, and so it seems pretty plausible to me that sort of maybe you want to put more sort of on the sort of upstream developer of the foundation model. That seems reasonably good to me. It seems to me that they're going to be able to deal with these at least some of these problems better than the downstream actor. And then the other thing that seems where the sort of foundation model provider can do things that no one else can do is this thing of sort of helping ensure compliance. So that's like sort of helping sort of catch out non-compliance. And so today I could go onto sort of a number of websites and I could start asking for medical advice, for example. Presumably that's sort of OpenAI, for example, are not licensed to give medical advice. And so there might be some kinds of tensions there, and so you might want to impose certain requirements on the foundation model sort of developer or deployer to make sure that they don't there aren't a bunch of non-compliant uses of their technology or a bunch of misuses. And I think they're going to be a particularly useful node for that kind of stuff. All of that seems, yeah. And then maybe going forward, if it's the case that like there are a bunch of harms that come from these systems that sort of is at the stage of the development process. So if it's the case that like you need to put in a ton of effort to make sure that your model is sufficiently aligned, and otherwise the world is going to have a really, really bad time. If that's the case, then it seems very plausible to me that you're going to need to have regulation that's specifically focused on the developer of that very, very big, potentially dangerous model.
And then you mentioned with regard to maybe you can approach that through like compute regulation, right?
Uh-huh.
You mentioned. I guess my sort of pushback on that, my idea would be something like, well, larger companies that are racing for AGI have big enough legal teams to deal with all of these regulatory red tape. But if you're like a relatively medium-sized AI sector research org, for example, and you want to red team these models, maybe you don't have the ability to deal with all of this regulation, but you still need large compute scale to like perform all these safety tasks. And so how do you think, wouldn't that disadvantage certain actors more than others in like ways that wouldn't actually be conducive to safer landscape? What do you think?
Yeah, so I think that stuff is tricky. My current guess is that there's a bunch of stuff you could do that looks like having sort of external actors do useful scrutiny or useful research on big models without them needing to develop them themselves. And so the kinds of things that you could do is you could like mandate certain kinds of access schemes for external researchers or external red teams. And so like for example, we recently wrote a blog post that argues that the National AI Research Resource, which is basically likely to be sort of a compute fund that the US government sets up and gives to a bunch of academic researchers and other researchers to do AI research, basically. We argued that should, part of what that should do is to set up a sort of the ability for these researchers to sort of access pre-trained models developed by other actors and do research on those instead of developing their own sort of de novo models or whatever. And I think in general that's going to be a useful direction to push in favor of. And so maybe what that looks like is you do something like for certain kinds of models you just say you big company or company that is developing a sort of AI system that is yay big or uses yay amount of compute, you need to bring in such and such a number of external red teams. You need to sort of pay the inference costs or sort of all the inference compute that they will need to do their work. We're gonna probably you need to put in place a bunch of different sort of safety sort of procedures to make sure that they're sort of less risk of sort of model theft or something like this. But in that kind of world, it seems to me that you're managing to thread the needle of sort of both make it the case that there's a larger number of actors who are able to sort of competently scrutinize these models as they become increasingly impactful and important in the world, while also not necessarily having to increase the number of actors who are developing their own models. And I think that seems like a useful direction to move to in my mind.
You mentioned that research might be one way forward to have a positive impact on the field of AI governance. Where do you feel like are currently like the biggest research gaps in the field, and what is the most under-researched, where do you need the most people?
I don't really know. I think there's a bunch of there's a lot of things that need to be done. I guess how I think about my work currently, and that I would sort of an approach that I want more people to sort of have is that I'm trying to do work that looks like figure out concrete recommendations that you want governments or AI labs to actually act upon. And my take is that sort of work in this space to date has used that frame not enough, basically. And I guess my take is that there's a bunch of useful work that probably looks something like, here's a potential recommendation or a potential thing that we might push for. An example might be this regime that I talked about of sort of a bunch of external scrutiny of frontier models. What would that regime actually look like in practice? And then really, really build up the policy proposal in a very, very detailed and a very, 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 very rigorous manner. And I just think that there's definitely not enough work that takes that kind of frame. And I would love to see more of it, and I'm trying to make it happen myself. And I hope folks in this room would be excited to do the same thing. And I guess that and so I think that there's this translation bit between sort of something like AI macro strategy and sort of an understanding of sort of the AI strategic landscape and sort of developing these sort of concrete recommendations. The interface between that and folks who are actually making decisions, I think is not working as well as it should. And more effort there I think seems really, really good. A hat trick.
Sorry, one last question. I promise. I was wondering whether you which entry resources into AI governance you could recommend. I'm aware of the AGI's fundamental course, AI governance track. Anything else? Any science newsletters that you generally follow?
So I don't have answers that are super good to that question because it was a long time ago since I started getting into the field. and so probably other people know more than I do. My guess is that the intro type resources that exist are like not up to par, or they should be a lot better than they currently are. I think one explanation for that is a lot of people who get into this field, a lot of them will end up working at organizations that are sort of making important decisions. And if you're doing that, it's going to be difficult for you to sort of write these kinds of sort of like curriculums and that kind of thing. And so it's difficult to sort of spend time on the field building bit. Things that I follow, some examples are I follow Import AI. A bunch of newsletters I follow are this Import AI. I guess like a bunch of news things around what's happening in AI seems like a good idea. Other things that spring to mind. I've started to follow some newsletters specifically on sort of the semiconductor supply chain. I don't remember what they're called right now. Doing that seems good to me. I don't know. Other than that, I would just recommend like try to read useful things. And so I would recommend going to this website, governance.ai, look at some of the stuff that we're producing to try to get a sense of what people are doing, and feel like I should probably have better answers to that question.
So there are a few AI technical researcher types in this room. Presumably there are some things that we could do that would be more helpful for crafting good governance things and other things. What are those things that we should be doing to make your life easier?
I think there's probably a ton. I would love there to be more. I think the pipeline from sort of technical work to policy work is not super good. And I think we should improve it. I'm not really sure how to improve it. One thing that I think is pretty plausible is this thing, or one sort of specific research idea that I'm pretty excited about is this sort of things, these kinds of things, where I think it's just, to some extent, I think it's like a little bit embarrassing that we haven't actually figured out a way to talk about some of these like alignment worries in a way that like sort of policymakers understand well enough for them to actually be put into present day policy documents. I think that's pretty bad, and I think it could actually be solved by like you get the right people in the room. So you get some technical folks in the room, you get some folks who actually understand the sort of policy side of things, and then together I think you could actually find ways to frame these issues in ways that where you frame it in such a way that like you're capturing a present day harm and that we expect to be more of a problem in the future. And then like you find a way to frame that problem that will sort of be a useful frame that you can sort of keep using as these systems become more and more capable. I think that's one example. I guess. Other than that, I'm not really sure. I guess one thing that I believe is folks who have tried to do or have done a bunch of technical work. I think more of them should try out doing policy work or do work that looks like thinking about governance. At the very, I think that seems very plausible to me. At the very least, like if you look at like at least my impressions of like the number of people who like try out sort of doing technical AI safety versus the number of people who like try out sort of AI governance work, I think the ratios there are like pretty skewed and probably like too skewed in the technical direction. I don't know more than that. Maybe talk to me or something. Might also be a useful thing. Any other questions? Cool. I hope that was helpful to people. If it was not, let me know. And you can also, if you want to talk to me or send me words, you can use my email there. You can also come up to me after this and we can chat. Thank you so much.